This happened to me, and I still feel my throat tighten when I talk about it. I'm telling you this as plainly as I can, because the night it happened, I realized the past has a way of sending you a bill when you least expect it. We were at a long oak table under the copper lamps at the Publican in Chicago's West Loop when my older sister, Lydia, laughed, slid a manila envelope across the wood, and said, "You owe us for raising you." Wine glasses clinked, and the room was butter warm from the roasted chicken and the din of Friday night conversations. But the words landed cold. It was my son Noah's engagement dinner. 24 people gathered to celebrate, the ring catching the light, my future in-laws smiling, and the envelope sat between us like a courtroom exhibit. I opened it. Inside was an invoice printed in neat columns. Room and board, 1979-1987. Utilities, electric, gas, phone, clothing, food, transportation, emotional labor, and at the bottom, a grand total with interest calculated per Illinois statutory rate, initialed by my sister's husband, Rick. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. Lydia's nails tapped the envelope. "Don't look so surprised, Evie," she said, using the nickname she knew I'd grown out of. "We added interest because we're not a charity." The lighting in the Publican is gentle, like it's trying to soften people's edges. But in that moment, everything felt harsh. The waitress approached with a fresh platter of frites and noticed our table had buckled into silence. Noah glanced at me, confused, then at the envelope. He had invited Lydia because I insisted family was family, no matter what, even after years of distance. That night, I was determined to be gracious. I had even reserved the private dining area so everyone could share stories about love and beginnings. I had not prepared for a bill for my childhood. Rick leaned back, expression smug, as if he'd just delivered a punchline. "We kept receipts," he said, "or at least we reconstructed them. You can pay us a third now, a third before the wedding, and the rest before they set off for their honeymoon." Someone on the far side of the table snorted. I couldn't tell if they were trying not to laugh or choke. My future daughter-in-law, Maya, blinked rapidly, as if she'd just walked into a scene mid-argument. My ex-husband, Dan, sat a chair away, and for once made the right choice. He kept his mouth shut. I stared at the invoice. There was a neat line item that read, "High school graduation party, catering $350, which would have been nice if I'd actually had a graduation party. Another line, "College dorm deposit, $500. I paid that deposit myself, sneaking a cashier's check out of my savings from the Walgreens on 79th and Halsted. My hands started moving on their own. I slid the envelope back across the table. "I don't know who you think you're talking to," I said, the words low and even, "but I don't owe you for what you stole." Lydia's smile didn't falter. "You lived in our house," she said. "Our food, our heat, our rules. It's time you pay your share." That night, the clinking of utensils and murmur of neighboring tables seemed to float up and away from us like helium balloons. Everything narrowed to the paper that insisted my debt had a number, and the woman who had been a guardian and a warden in the same breath. I was 58 years old, a mother of one, a mortgage underwriter who knew the price of things, and I could still feel my little sister heart, small and taped together from years of fixing what other people broke, beating too fast. I said, "Not here." It came out as a speaker's command, steadier than I felt. Then I stood, excused myself with the brittle politeness of Midwesterners at the edge of a cliff, and walked to the restroom to breathe. I watched myself in the mirror under the publican's kind yellow lights. Older, yes. Silver in my curls. The sort of lines you earn. But the eyes were the same ones that had learned to count pennies and secrets. I pressed my fingers to the counter and spoke to my reflection like I was coaching a client through a crisis. You are not that girl, I said. You are not powerless. When I came back, the envelope was back in front of my place. Someone had tried to lighten the mood with a toast. Noah's friend from college told a joke, and people laughed too loudly. Lydia and Rick had slid back into conversation with my cousin, like the invoice wasn't radioactive. I took my seat. The rest of the dinner was like riding a train through a tunnel. Sounds compressed, faces glimpsed in flashes. I participated as needed, because it was my son's night, but inside my mind, another timeline kicked on like a projector. I was 17 when our mother died on a rain-slick March morning, a commuter car on the Dan Ryan throwing sparks into the gray. Lydia was 24, married to Rick, and already had her nails always done, pink and white acrylics, like little shields. She took me in. Because that's what family does. And because the small Social Security survivors benefit and the payout from our mother's tiny life insurance policy would run through a guardian. The court named Lydia that guardian in a hushed courtroom inside the Richard J. Daley Center, where I stood in my only black skirt and stared at the big Picasso in Daley Plaza, afterward to keep from crying. Lydia's lawyer said things, and papers moved, and I remember the clerk stamping documents with a flat-chested thump that felt like punctuation on a chapter I hadn't agreed to. What I remember most is the way money turned into air. A check would arrive and disappear for the house. I got a bunk bed in the spare room and a new set of chores and a long list of rules. Rick would hold a receipt between two fingers, shake it, and say, "You think gas pays itself?" When I asked for $20 for the yearbook, he gave me a speech about responsibility and then handed me a stack of towels to fold. My senior year, I worked a cashier job at the Jewel-Osco on 95th after school and saved my money in a shoebox. Lydia borrowed from that shoebox 3 times. Just until Saturday, she would say. And then it was Monday. And then it was gone. I learned not to leave my door unlocked. The night of Noah's dinner, those old rules tried to reassert themselves. Keep quiet. Don't make a scene. Fold into the room like you owe it something. But I had a son with kind eyes and a future that was not going to be touched by their cruelty, and old traps lose their power if you see them from above. So I ate my roast chicken and drank my club soda. I'd stopped drinking after the divorce because nobody needed to make my stubbornness sloppier. Clapped when Maya's father told the story of how she'd fallen during her first skating lesson and gotten up laughing, smiled at the servers, and hugged the couples as they left into the chilly West Loop night. We took photos beneath the warm brick walls. The ring caught the light. Lydia and Rick left with a casual wave. The envelope remained. I slipped it into my tote, not because I respected it, but because I had a feeling it would become a key. After everyone had gone, I stood on Fulton Market with the lights strung overhead and called an Uber, because my feet in their sensible heels weren't up for the walk back to the Green Line. The car pulled up, and I slid into the back, like collapsing into a quiet pocket. On the ride up to Rogers Park, I opened the envelope again, stared at the columns, and spotted something that made the back of my neck heat. There was a line that read, "Guardianship administrative fee, 10%. It was typed like it belonged. It did not belong. Administrative fee, guardianship. The words rubbed together like two sticks until a small flame took. Guardians were required, back then and now, to file annual accountings to the court. They weren't supposed to be paid unless the court approved it. And even then, 10% of what? The line item had a number so round it felt like a story someone told themselves in the mirror, and then decided it was true. At home, my little apartment on Lunt Avenue felt like a safe harbor. The thrifted maps on the wall, the plant that refused to die even when I forgot to water it. The stack of library books next to my mug that said, "I love an unbalanced ledger," in a joke only underwriting nerds would find funny. I put the envelope on my kitchen table and sat with my phone, scrolling. Clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County, Probate Division, Guardianship, Records. The website was gray and dry and absolutely beautiful to me because it spelled rules. There was a link about how to request records on a closed guardianship case. There was a reminder that fraud tolls limitations. That line was like water on parched ground. I slept badly, like I always do when my brain is building something, dreaming of columns and stamps and our mother's laugh in the kitchen when she'd burn toast and scrape it into the sink with a butter knife. In the morning, I put on a navy blazer. I reserved for serious conversations, pulled my hair back, and took the red line to Lake, then walked east across the grid to the Daily Center, steel and glass, and the world's uglier sister looking modern. I passed the big Picasso and looked up at its odd face. We had an understanding, me and that giant creature. We were both deeply out of place and absolutely exactly where we were supposed to be. Inside, I swallowed the ache of memory and got in line. The clerk behind the glass had the kind of face that has seen it all and will see it again. I gave her my mother's name, my own, the year, 1979, and said, "There was a guardianship." She typed. She frowned. She typed again, then went to the back. When she returned, she had a box, a real, honest-to-God banker's box with my life rattling around inside it like loose screws. "Table 3, she said. "You can review it there. No food, no pens, pencil only." My hands shook for exactly 1 second. Then they stopped. I carried the box to table 3 and lifted the lid. On top lay a stack of petitions, orders, receipts, each page bordered by the ghosts of fingers that had touched them before. The first order named Lydia as my guardian. I traced the judge's signature with my eyes. There were supposed to be annual accountings, each year an explanation of what came in, where it went. There were exactly 2. Both were thin. Both had the same strange roundness to the numbers that had set off alarms in my head last night. And then, there it was, an affidavit of consent dated 3 days before my 18th birthday. It said I agreed that survivor benefits could be used for household expenses because the ward enjoys said benefits. At the bottom was my signature, except it wasn't, not even close. I know my own hand the way I know my son's laugh. The signature on that page rounded the R in my last name like a balloon. Mine hooks it sharp like a fish hook. Someone had practiced me badly and filed it with a clerk who had a stack of 100 things to stamp that day. and nobody with both time and curiosity to ask a teenager if the page was hers. The room did a slow pan, like a camera circling a person who has just realized the thing she has always suspected is not just a story. "Ma'am?" A clerk's voice. "You doing okay?" I nodded. My thumb had pressed into the paper so hard it left a crescent. I slid the affidavit back into its folder like I was putting away a loaded gun. Sometimes the thing that breaks your heart is exactly the thing that steadies your hand. I copied the case number. I ordered certified copies. I asked, with the politeness I've been told could cut a man if I sharpened it, for the index of filings. The clerk peered at me. "You know there's a process if you want to reopen," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm just getting ready." On my way out, I stopped at the Picasso again. A man in a suit stood beneath it eating a pretzel. The pigeons hadn't bothered to read the sign about not feeding them. The sky was Chicago October, high and clean. I looked up and felt something let go in my chest, an old thread snapping. I took out my phone and texted Lydia. "I got your invoice. Keep your calculator warm." Her 3 dots bubbled like a tiny drum roll. Then, "You should have thanked me last night. You just embarrassed yourself." I typed back, "See you soon. We'll do this on paper." I didn't do rage texts. I did receipts. That night I called a lawyer, not a fancy one, not a television guy, but a woman named Priya Shah, who ran a small practice in Ravenswood and had done time at Legal Aid Chicago. I'd looked up a case she'd won where she forced a former guardian to pay back funds decades later because the ward only discovered the theft when she found the papers cleaning out a closet. "Fraud tolls limitations," Priya had told the Tribune in a quote that made me want to bake her a cake. Her assistant put me on for the next afternoon. On the bus up Lincoln, I remembered being 16 and asking Lydia for $20 for a field trip. "Ask the state," she'd said. "They're the ones paying for you." The cruelty had been soft then, wrapped in a joke. Now it wore a blazer and carried an invoice. Priya's office smelled like old paper and lemon oil. She wore no-nonsense flats and had kind eyes. I laid the envelope and my copies on her desk. She read quietly, the way good people read, pen in hand, not interrupting, eyebrows doing the small things that tell you what's landing. "This," she said, touching the affidavit, "is either sloppily drafted or intentionally vague. And this," her pen tapped the signature, "is not your hand." "No," I said. "It isn't?" She looked at me. "I'm going to ask you a question I always hate asking," she said gently. "Are you ready for how long and how ugly this might be?" I looked down at my hands. At 58, they're my mother's hands, bones and tendons showing the work they've done. "I've got time," I said. "And I have a son who deserves to see what it looks like when a woman decides she will not be bullied in public and she will not be robbed in private. So let's make it ugly." Priya smiled the tight smile of someone who has been waiting for a client to say that. "Then we start with a petition to reopen the guardianship," she said. "We ask for a full accounting. We subpoena bank records. You keep everything calm and polite, and you never ever respond to a taunt." She drafted that petition like a carpenter cutting true. I signed it with my actual hand, firm and clear. We made a list: Social Security records request, subpoena for the life insurance payout distribution, request to the utility companies for records in our old address on Damen. We would show where money had gone by showing where it had not gone. not to tuition, not to books, not to clothes that fit. We would put absence on the record like a fingerprint. When she filed the petition, the clerk looked up from the counter, took in my face, my age, my steadiness. "Good luck," she said, and it wasn't the flat good luck people say to end a conversation. It was the kind that acknowledges history. The hearing date came faster than I expected, and slower than I wanted, which is how time behaves when you live inside a case. Lydia and Rick hired a lawyer with a shiny watch and a confident slouch. He filed a motion to dismiss, saying I had waited too long, that I'd slept on my rights, that their care and kindness had been met with ingratitude. He attached an affidavit from Lydia, swearing to the correctness of her memory. He attached a grainy photocopy of a budget written in pink pen that might as well have been a crayon, for as precise as it was. He attached the invoice. On the morning of the hearing, I sat on a bench outside the courtroom on the 18th floor of the Daily Center and watched the lake show itself in a sliver between glass towers. I sipped from a paper cup of coffee from Intelligentsia and kept my breathing measured the way you do before a flight takes off. Priya reviewed our exhibits. She didn't tell me it would be okay, like I was a child. She said, "Let's do this," like she was my partner. Lydia arrived in a powder blue suit with her usual hair helmet. Rick wore a tie with tiny gavel prints. He grinned at me like we were at a reunion. "Evie," he said smooth, "still dramatic, I see." I looked at him and felt nothing but the clean space where anger had been replaced by intent. "We're on the record now, Rick," I said. "Save it for the mic." When the clerk called our case, the courtroom hushed the way a church does when the organ stops. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with iron gray hair and a voice like coffee. She looked at me for a beat too long, and I knew she saw what I was trying to keep cool. The history in my jaw, the way my fingers didn't shake because I was holding them against the table. Lydia's lawyer stood and began his speech about time and memory. He said being a guardian is burdensome, thankless work. He said I had benefited from their home and their love. He said family disputes should not be dragged through the courts decades later. Priya stood, and the way she said, "Your Honor," made me want to cheer. She didn't talk about feelings. She talked about math. She talked about signatures. She talked about accountings and the absence thereof. She held up the affidavit like a mask and asked the judge to compare it to my driver's license signature, to a signed lease from 1988 that we'd dragged out of a storage facility in Bridgeport that still smelled like old motor oil and mold. She used the word concealment the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. And when she was done, the judge put on her reading glasses, looked at the papers for a long time, and said the words I had waited to hear since I was 17. "Motion denied. The guardianship is reopened. Full accounting ordered within 60 days. Subpoenas to issue forthwith." Lydia inhaled like she'd swallowed a sharp fish bone. Rick's jaw worked. The clerk, God bless her, said, "Next case," and banged the list with a nail that looked like it had been painted in the hallway between calls. We stepped into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights make everyone look a little more honest. Lydia turned to me and let out that ugly laugh, the one that had started this whole thing. "You think you're going to get a payday," she said. "We fed you, clothed you, gave you a roof. You're going to embarrass yourself when all this shows we saved your ungrateful hide." I thought about saying 100 things. Instead, I said, we'll see. The next weeks were a war of paper, subpoenas to a bank on Western that had changed names twice and merged 3 times, a request to Social Security that came back with a neat printout of every check ever issued in my name, a scan of utility records that showed electricity and gas paid on time, while my school fines went unpaid. Somewhere in there, I found a check made out to cash that matched, almost exactly, the price of the boat Rick bought in 1982, a boat he kept at Burnham Harbor and named Family Time. I printed that one and stuck it on my fridge with a magnet until the day I would slide it across a table like the world's ugliest Valentine. When the bank finally complied, the numbers told a story that couldn't lie to itself. Transfers from an account labeled Guardianship EM into an account labeled Household L&R. Withdrawals at a department store I couldn't afford to walk into back then. A pattern of round numbers that would make any auditor's mouth water. Their lawyer fought us on every page. "You're digging," he'd say. "You're reaching." He filed a second motion, a third. Each time the judge set her mouth, listened, and sent us back to our corners. Each time I learned to sit with the discomfort like an athlete sits in an ice bath, full body, no flinching, breathing through the parts that wanted to run. I did not call Lydia. I did not text her. The only message she received came on letterhead. The day we reconvened for the accounting, I wore the navy blazer again and the sensible heels that don't make you feel like a foal. Priya carried our binder. It was heavy and beautiful. Lydia's binder was lighter, but its tabs were pink. It looked like a scrapbook. The clerk swore us all in with the bored efficiency of a person who has heard every lie there is and still respects the ritual of raising a hand. Lydia took the stand, and for the first time in her life, spoke without the armor of an audience who owed her anything. She said words that had kept their shape for years, but under oath sounded strange even to her. We, us, house, family. Priya's questions were gentle where they could be, and exact where they had to be. "Who filled out this affidavit?" she asked. "Whose idea was the administrative fee? What evidence do you have that this graduation party occurred?" "I don't remember," Lydia said more than once. "Is that your signature?" Priya asked, pointing to the line under Evie, Ward. "Yes," Lydia said, without looking at me. Then she looked. The room held that look like a breath. "It isn't," I said softly. The judge held up a hand to quiet me. Priya waited. Lydia licked her lips. "It is," she said, the tiniest wobble in her voice, like the first loose shingle in a storm. Priya put my driver's license on the overhead camera. Then the affidavit. The judge leaned forward. Even Lydia's lawyer leaned forward, like he could will the strokes to match. They did not. The judge's finger tapped the screen. "Counsel," she said to Lydia's lawyer, "I suggest you have a conversation with your client in the hallway." They disappeared. When they returned, Lydia's face looked like wet paper. Rick looked, for the first time in the decades I'd known him, small. "Your Honor," their lawyer said, voice flat, "my client is prepared to stipulate that the signature may not be the ward's." The judge tilted her head. "May not." He swallowed. "Is not." That was the exact moment the ground tilted in my favor. You could feel the air change, the way a room changes when a storm breaks and the pressure lifts. Priya did not smile. She simply turned a page and kept going. We argued about interest. We argued about tracing. We argued about what was reasonable in the 1980s. The judge did not want a fight about theories. She wanted numbers. Priya gave her numbers like rails to run on. In the end, the judge ordered a surcharge, repayment of the misused funds, plus statutory interest calculated from the date of each unlawful withdrawal. She added costs, she ordered fees, and then, in a simple, crushing sentence, she referred the matter to the state's attorney for review of potential fraud. The clerk typed, the printer hummed, paper slid through the machine the way it always does, indifferent, inevitable. And then we were in the hallway again, holding papers that changed the shape of the past. Lydia turned to me, and for the first time since she'd cut my shoebox open with a steak knife to pry out just a few 20s, she looked like a person who had been caught by a rule she never believed applied to her. "You can't do this," she said, small. "We raised you." "You were paid to," I said, "and you charged extra." She laughed then, that awful laugh that had started this, but it wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a sound a person makes when they run out of stories that work. She reached out like she wanted to touch my arm, to reset the scene to an old script where I played the grateful ward. I stepped back. Rick muttered a curse under his breath and stared very hard at the floor. We went back to the clerk's window to sign what needed signing. The clerk, a different woman than the one who had helped me the first day, printed the final ledger from the accounting, a neat spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and interest. She put it on the counter and slid it across the glass toward Lydia. "This is what you owe," she said, voice perfectly professional. "With interest." It should not have felt like a holy thing, but in that moment, it was. Lydia stared at the total. Her face moved through disbelief into logistics, into the question that had always gotten her out of trouble. How do we spin this? But there was no spin. There was only the number. It sat there, and no laugh could lift it. We walked out of the Daily Center into the noon glare. The Picasso was still there, a ridiculous genius. I wanted to call my mother, to say, "I did it, I made it right." But the dead have to settle for the way we keep them alive. So I touched the handle of the door and felt the steel under my palm and the city's hum. And then Noah called. "How did it go?" he asked. "It went," I said, and my voice cracked. And I didn't mind because some breaks release pressure, not pain. "We're okay," he exhaled, a sound like relief being filed. "Dinner tonight?" he asked. "Lou Malnati's on me." "That's a bribe," I said, teasing, because normal felt like a miracle. "And I accept." That evening, we sat in a booth at Lou's on Lincoln Avenue, the red-checked tablecloth and the smell of butter crust feeling like an embrace. Maya asked me to tell her the story from the beginning, and I did, because the beginning is the only way the end makes sense. When I got to the part about the clerk sliding the bill, she put her hands over her mouth. Dramatic, yes, but earned. "With interest?" she whispered. "With interest," I said. "Because time owes you sometimes, too." We ate, we laughed, we made plans for a wedding that would not include people who believe love is a ledger. Later, in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope that had started it, and beside it, the court's paper that ended it. I thought about 17-year-old me, about the shoebox, about boats named Family Time. I thought about every woman who was told to be grateful for the cage built in her name. I put the papers in a folder labeled with the case number and slid it onto the shelf between my cookbooks and the atlas, because the past can live in the house without running it. A week later, a letter arrived from the state's attorney's office acknowledging receipt of the judge's referral. I didn't need more. I had what I came for: an accounting, a number, and the sight of a woman being told by a stranger behind glass that she owed what she took. I went for a walk along the lake, the water flat and shining under a sky that forgives nothing and hides no one. And when I turned back toward home, I walked past the high school where my son played basketball in a too-big jersey, past the Walgreens where I'd bought that first cashier's check, past the lives inside the windows that did not know about me and did not need to. At night, when I can't sleep, I go back to the moment in the hallway, the clerk's hand, the paper sliding, Lydia's face folding in on itself. I don't linger. I don't gloat. I file it like I file everything, and I let the drawer close. Unless I wake in the dark with my mother's laugh in my head, and then I say it out loud, once, because some lines belong to the person who earned them, with interest. And when the room goes quiet again, and the city hums, I think of a younger me sitting at a long table, learning the price of her own breath. And I promise her something older women can say without flinching: I won't ever send you the bill. The end.